Hello and welcome to episode 150 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're talking about a potential roster change, the first one after the first CDL major of the 2025 season. And we're going to continue to talk about some of the fallout from the first major and some of the teams that we didn't get to talk about on episode 149. So if you missed that, if you want to hear us talk about four of the top teams at the major, please go back and do so. Before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. Like you said, I actually was looking before this episode. So we're at 204 subscribers on YouTube now, and I was looking. I think what was the exact date? I already lost it. I closed that tab, but I think the YouTube channel was created on February 3rd, 2021. So I don't know if that's like the first day we went live or just when you made it, but either way, we got to be pretty close to our 4-year anniversary. So that's pretty cool. Um, and yeah, like you said, we doing things a little bit differently now for this major cycle and of coverage on our end, just because we got some time before the next set of qualifiers kicks off. And like Preston said, we covered 4 teams last episode. We got about 4 teams to cover today, give or take, and then we'll finish things off in the next episode, and hopefully that'll bridge the gap before the qualifiers. But yeah, we already got our first report on a potential roster move, and the way things, you know, happened at the major, wouldn't be surprised if other teams are at least considering them and more reports start funneling in. So it's a pretty exciting time, even if we do have a little break in the action.
Yeah, this is from earlier today. So we're recording this on Wednesday night. Ronnie Intel, formerly CDL Scrim Intel, he posted on Breaking Point that the Vancouver Surge are looking at either Afro or Neptune as potential additions to their roster. And he named that they would replace Hixie in this scenario. Obviously, Afro and Neptune, veterans of the CDL, Neptune very kind of infamously signed that 3-year deal with the Gorillas. What was that, after the 2021 season? And then the Gorillas were like, yeah, this whole esports thing's kind of silly. And so him and Arcides were, I think, out of there pretty soon after. Afro really made his name with the London Royal Ravens, and then he's been with Minnesota and I believe LAG, if I'm not mistaken. But he's been trying to get LAT, yeah. And he's been trying to get back into the CDL since then. Your thoughts on this move? I vaguely, I don't know if you said this on air or it was like pre-show before last episode, but I think you were like, yeah, Vancouver really has to make a change. So do you think this is the kind of move that you were looking at, or what do you think overall about something like this?
Yeah, I think it was before we went live last episode, but it was just based on Vancouver's performance at the major, really. Like during the qualifiers, they had a couple of game 5 matches that I can't remember. They ended up going 4-3, I think, or 3-4, something like that. And they had a couple of game 5s that they lost, I believe, early on, and then they might have clutched up in a couple. But either way, it was the case always felt like I need to see more of this team, right? And I kept on feeling like I wasn't sure what to think and how much, you know, more seeing more gameplay from them, how much that would help in my analysis and thought process around the team and everything. And I just keep coming back to really what I think the community was thinking, and even if it wasn't of the community, what I was thinking in the off season when this roster was officially announced or even originally reported on, is just it really is like very reliant on Abuza and maybe not to the same extent, but O4 as well, to be those quote unquote like star slayers of the team. And adding in players like Hixie and Nasty, they've never been the stars on the teams they've been on previously. They've always been more role players, willing to do the dirty work, willing to do in Nasty's case, and I guess even in Hixie's case in his time where he literally won his first pro event that he played with in Toronto. Both of those guys were like they're not lighting up the scoreboard. They'll have their pop off moments, sure, but they're doing the things to enable the rest of the team and making winning plays that don't necessarily show up in the stat sheet or don't necessarily get the praise that you know if Shotzi gets a 4-piece, that's always going to be praised over like Hicksy or Nasty making a flank at the end of a game to get their team spawned in a 240 hard point or something like that. Uh, not a great example, but for lack of a better one off the top of my head, like that's where my head's at right now with this. Um, so with the roster of Abuza, 04, Hicksy, and Nasty, it just felt like they were always going to be missing that star slaying potential. And if it's a team that isn't willing to spend on a star player, then the the additions of Hicksy and Nasty, unless they just went through like a meteoric climb in play style or just statistics, however you want to phrase it, like that just wasn't what was going to happen with these guys. And this is I feel like that's what we've seen. And in the report from Ronnie Intel, he puts down here that Hicksy had a 0.85 KD in the major one cycle, which I assume counts the minor. I'm not 100% sure, but either way, it would be major one qualifiers and major one at a minimum. And that ranks 49th out of 52 players. And without looking at it, I would assume that if it's not 3 Falcons players below him, I wouldn't. I'm just gonna assume it's 3 Falcons players ranked below him. But that's so 52, yeah, because 48 would be uh the 12 teams times 4, and then I feel like
There are
there's been
two more
it would be
Vegas
Hook, it would be
players.
Hook, and then the 3 subs for Falcons would be the 52. So I feel like probably 3 Falcons players below him, which would mean he would be the lowest KD for a non-Vegas Falcons player. That's just a guess, not 100% sure. But either way, it's not great. And again, I don't think anyone, even probably if you asked Tixie, probably wouldn't have said like he would expect to be on the extreme opposite of that, right? Like he wouldn't be expecting to be at the top of any KD uh, leaderboards or anything like that. He's always going to be that guy who's like sitting around a 0.9 or a 1.0 KD, and he's going to try to win you games in search and going to try to win you games by making the small plays on the map that don't always get noticed. And with this team like Vancouver, it just feels like they don't have that firepower to compete with some of these other squads, especially in the respawns. And I think that's really what we saw in Major One. So in their first matchup, it was a rematch from um was it was early on in the qualifiers. I think you mentioned that Toronto played Vancouver and it went to game
Yeah,
5, round 11.
I think it was
Um,
Vancouver's first match of the season.
okay, and this time it was a 3-0. They lose by over 100 in the hard point. Um, in a 3-1 the control. The search is a 6-5 and Hicksy drops 11 kills. So that's what you're getting from Hicksy if he's on the team, right? Like he's capable of doing well in the search, but it's the respawns where he necessarily doesn't stand out. And then we get another match, Minnesota versus Vancouver, which was a rematch of like that banger 5-map set from the last week of the qualifiers where 04 dropped like 130 something kills or whatever it was. In this case, they Vancouver wins the opening hard point, but then they lose the next 3 maps after that. And in that series, if we look at the box score, nobody on Vancouver had a positive KD. Nasty had the highest at a 0.96. 04 and Abuza both 0.88 and Hicksy at a 0.81. And again, we always emphasize on the Ego Chall podcast, KDs aren't everything. And I think that was the justification for this roster, right? Like you got to think like what we talked from the perspective of Rambo and everything. Like we know uh, how smart Rambo is and how valued of a Call of Duty mind he is in the scene. Putting this roster together, you got to think his idea was like trying to um, cultivate that like team atmosphere and not necessarily going for, you need one guy dropping 40 kills every hard point to win. If we do everything as a team, get our breaks together, we're coordinated, have good chemistry, then we can take that approach. And clearly that just hasn't worked out well for them so far, and it's come to the point where they're at least considering replacing Hixie. I do think of the two reported names, I definitely um eh, I think highly of Neptune. I think he's like one of those players who he's gotten a couple opportunities and he's had his chance to show what he's capable of, and he's been a little inconsistent in the CDL in previous years, in my eyes at least. Like he has that pop off potential and just hasn't been consistent. um Afro, I feel like is similar too, and just he like was played really well when he first came on with London, and I believe he would have played with Nasty on that team at one point. Those rosters are kind of blurred together in my head. I know there was that Gizmo guy, and Zero was on the team with them at one point. I feel like, so I think Nasty was there, not 100%, but they were together on LAT last year very briefly. And I mean, that was Afro, Ghosty, Joe Deceives, and Nasty, and then Kremp came in for Joe Deceives, and then Joe Deceives came in for Afro, came back in and replaced Afro. I think something like that. So,
Yeah, that sounds right.
Afro has experience playing with Nasty, as far as I remember. So if they went down that route, for a chemistry perspective, and obviously with Abuza, too, like that would give them three-fourths European players. um so I wouldn't be surprised if they went the Afro route, but I think both of these guys, especially, based on what's also said in the report about how Neptune and Afro have been playing in the challenger scene this year, it sounds like they're both doing well, and they would both be upgrades in the slaying department. And if the concern is like how would someone like Afro or how would Neptune gel with the rest of the squad and as a midseason addition, yada yada. Like I feel like you would have to lean towards Afro just because of that pre-existing chemistry with Nasty, but that's just where my head's at. Obviously, not 100% sure. And this is just the first report, so we don't even know if they're definitely making a change. And I mean, it could be multiple players changed. It might not even be Hixie. Who knows? But for based on what we know so far, if Afro or Neptune were to enter this Vancouver Surge roster in place of Hixie, I think it's an immediate upgrade in the slaying department. I would be a little concerned about the impact in S&D, but again, if they're losing maps even when Hixie's dropping 11, like it feels like there is room for improvement with or without Hixie in that regard too. So could be interesting.
Yeah, so Afro's been playing in the European challenger scene, and then Neptune has been playing in the North American challenger scene. And both teams, or both of their respective teams, won the Elite Stage 1 playoffs. So Afro's been playing with Eric Boom, Rafi, and F. Dot in Europe, and they're known as they're under the Team Notorious banner. And then Neptune has been playing with Fellow, Craze, and Lunars under the Omit
That's yeah.
Brooklyn team. And so they won the Stage 1 playoffs and the most recent North American Cup, which is like the online stuff. Which I thought, I mean, kind of off topic, but I saw that Fellow had tweeted the like contract signing gift. So I
I
don't
saw that
know,
too. Yeah.
I don't know what that's about, but I guess we could,
On
yeah, keep
on
an eye
a
on it.
on a somewhat related note, did you see Fellow's other tweet too of a picture with him and Lunars when Lunars was like really little?
No, I didn't.
So apparently when Fellow was on Rise, which would have been uh during IW, I believe it would have been. It was an event I was at. So was it Atlanta and IW? I don't know, but Fellow tweeted a picture of the Lunars kid that he's teaming with now, and it was like shout out to this guy. It was like Fellow was in his Rise jersey, and the kid was like one up came up to his hip, and obviously Fellow's a tall guy. He's taller than me, but the kid Lunars was obviously very young at the time, and now they're teaming together, so that was kind of funny.
Yeah, that would have been 2017, so 8 years ago or so. But
issue.
yeah, I mean, Fella's been around a long time, and playing with a veteran player like that would help anybody. I also said earlier in the show that Neptune signed that 3-year contract. I got him confused with Spart
Oh
and
yeah, yeah,
Narcides, but Neptune was on that LAG team as well. He teamed with Clay on NYSL, if I'm not
yeah,
mistaken, and
yeah.
I think he had like some kind of thumb injury, right? Or I remember something about Neptune having like
Mm,
some kind of issue when he was with NYSL, like prevented him from practicing or something along those lines. Maybe I'm mistaken, but it feels like it was Neptune for whatever reason. But yeah, he was kind of like seen as like a really like up and coming young talent
yeah,
around that time. And obviously, that's just kind of like the nature of the CDL. There are only so many spots, but people said he's been playing pretty well, and obviously the team results look pretty good, at least on paper. And maybe it is time for him to get called back up, or same with Afro getting called back up to the CDL. This is just a kind of a weird move in general for Vancouver because we talked about it, I think, on 2 episodes ago now. Vancouver did not start off the season very well. I think they were 1-3 going into like the last 2 weeks, and then they just rattled off 3 straight wins to get into the winners bracket. And then obviously when they get to the major, like you mentioned, they don't compete nearly as heavily with Toronto as they did online, and then they only win one map in the losers bracket. So they finish 1-6 at the major. It just feels like there has to be a change, or at least when you get double first rounded, there is the very great possibility that there is a change coming. I don't know if like a team like Boston is going to make a change because it's just so surprising that they were even in that position to begin with. But I think Vancouver just thought we're probably maybe better than that, and maybe we can upgrade, at least in some part of our roster. Even though I don't know if we'd had incredibly high expectations for the Surge roster coming into the season, but it's going to be interesting. I do feel bad for Hicksy because that means he's never even got really a full season. Like I don't even know if combined he's gotten a full season in the CDL, but that just kind of shows how competitive and how tough this league is. That they won an event with Toronto, and it was like, okay, like we'll see you later, bud. And now they get double first rounded after having a really good finish to the qualifying stage, and it seems like he's kind of on his way out. And I don't know if that there's another team out there that is going to pick him up and believe that he's going to solve some of their issues, which is obviously pretty tough for him. But yeah, it's going to be a weird. I would imagine this is not going to be the only roster change of this period, but it does seem like it could be the first.
yeah. I think if I'm gonna check COD Gamepedia real quick, but just like thinking about it in my head before saying it, yeah. So his last event, technically before uh this past one, would have been COD Champs 2023, where they obviously were in the winners bracket and they beat Subliners, and then they get 5-0'd in the grand finals to come in second. So you get second at champs to out of the league, and then back in the league this year, potentially only for one event, which would be 7 qualifiers, a minor match, so like 10-ish matches this year he's
Yeah,
played. And like you said, I do think, from a financial standpoint, it wouldn't surprise me if the Surge just like cut ties with him if they're signing someone else and replacing him. At the same time, I also don't know how expensive Hicksy's contract would be. It might be close to the league. Actually, they got rid of the league minimum, didn't
yeah.
they?
So I don't think it'll really matter in terms of money because I don't know
Yeah.
if Neptune or Afro is going to be able to demand much from them.
So I could see them keeping Hicksy on as a sub too, and but that's also, paying 5 players is more than paying 4 players, no matter how much the players are getting. So, could be interesting from that side of things too. But yeah, I mean, it is, it's tough for someone like Hicksy because that's just like I said, that's the type of player he's shown us in his limited time in the CDL. Is he's that guy who isn't going to be one of those highly coveted free agents or trade pieces or something like that, just because you always, people are going to look at the stats, and that his name isn't going to be the first name that pops up on the stats in a lot of regards. And that's why if you think about it, someone like Rambo, who we talk about as a really smart COD guy, good mind for COD, all that, that's kind of the player he was, especially towards the end of his career when we were both like, you know, getting more involved in COD esports. Like he was that OBJ player, which the OBJ role just doesn't even exist anymore. If you can't do OBJ work while also having a neutral or positive KD,
Yeah.
then
Like
you're just
Dashy is
not on the
probably like one
team.
of the best OBJ players in the
Yeah,
league, and he's like the AR Slayer.
yeah. Um, but that's the type of player Rainbow was good at search. He wasn't dropping ridiculous 1.5 KDs and respawns. He was one of those guys willing to do their work. So if somebody as a coach is going to give a player like Hicksy an opportunity, it makes sense that that was a connection here. And if it didn't pan out and, things aren't going well in the respawns, the, thing that teams are always going to be looking at nowadays is that slaying potential and the KDs. And if you got a guy dropping a 0.85 versus someone dropping a 1 point whatever in challengers, you might need to give the challengers player a shot if you think it's going to translate to a better KD against the pro players. So, um, yeah, I think overall for Vancouver, we'll have to see if they end up doing the change here, which player it is. If they do, I mean, it's possible they go a different route than either Afro or Neptune. I do think though, like of those names, Afro makes sense to me with the nasty previous connection there. Interestingly enough, though, if they are looking for a sub player in this, a very notable name and Surge alum that was not mentioned in the report is Pred. I do not envision Pred going to this team if he is returning before Major 2. It just wouldn't make sense for him coming off of, a world championship to play with a team that he doesn't think is capable of being back on that grand final stage at champs. In my eyes, like I feel like he's going to want to go with a team that he's comfortable with, which is that C9 example with previous history there, or he wants to go to a juggernaut that is looking to make a move after Major 1. So is interesting. His name isn't here, but there's still time. Maybe he sneaks in, and then we're having a whole different conversation. But we'll have to wait and see.
I think it's just weird because Hicksy is, at least from what I've seen, pretty well liked by a few of the CDL pros,
Yeah,
and because they always say like how much they like him and stuff, but you would think like the Friendship League moniker of the CDL, you would think would seem to favor Hicksy in that regard. Like he's a well liked guy. Okay, like let's find a place for him. I don't know if it's just like maybe he doesn't have the reputation that a player like Rambo, for example, like Rambo was really never seen as like the like most skilled player necessarily, but he had a reputation for being one of, if not the smartest player. And I guess if you don't have the reputation or you don't have maybe the connections or the friendships in the right places, because he might be friends with some of these guys, but like they're on like LAT, and like what are they gonna do about that, or if they just have the opportunity to, in an example, I guess, is to upgrade with Envoy, like from that COD Champs finals team. Like it just, wrong place, wrong time, I guess, for Hicksy. I did think though that they might keep him or at least let this team ride a little bit, but when you're on the cusp or you're on that edge where you're kind of floating around the 8th spot, and even if it is pretty early in the season, I don't think teams like to just like languish there, for lack of a better term. I think they want to at least try to make a move before it's too late.
I think honestly the whole Pred situation with Hook joining Optic so early might be like a lingering thought in the back of these teams' mind as like, there were probably people thinking after Major 1, if our team isn't doing well, we can maybe go after Hook, and because Hook was just lighting it up in challengers. And him getting picked up earlier than expected because of the whole Pred thing now teams are like, oh, can we afford to sit back and wait on guys like Afro and Neptune if they continue doing well in challengers, and other teams might, jump the gun and try to get them quicker. So uh, that 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 could be a wrinkle in this thing that causes some other team. I mean, maybe even just this report that Surge are interested in Afro Neptune. Maybe some other teams are like, looking at Afro's teammates, Neptune's teammates, like you said, maybe even Fellow or um, Lunars. It's interesting. We got some time here, so could be. I'm hopeful that we'll have some more roster rumors to talk about.
Yeah, that's a good point too. That they might feel more inclined to pull the trigger on some of these moves now, because for Vancouver, for example, is in ninth place, so they would be the first team out if the season ended today and they were trying to qualify for champs, and they're one spot ahead of C9, who we've been talking about is like the most logical destination for Pred. If just discounting like Phase, LAT, Toronto, Optic, like, but C9 would seem like the move for him, and if they add Pred, it seems like they would leapfrog Vancouver pretty easily, in my opinion. And then who knows? Like Vancouver's down to 10th at that point, and they would need to jump at least like Minnesota, Boston, Miami, one of those or one or two of those teams. And yeah, you might be right. It could just be like, let's make the move now. Let's not wait, especially if a team behind us might pretty quickly leapfrog us over the next 2 or 3 weeks when we get back up.
And the only thing to really play devil's advocate there, I guess it doesn't necessarily apply as much to Miami, because Miami did have a strong performance at the major, so they're not technically behind a team like Vancouver. But uh, again, just to throw the opposite perspective out here, talking about other teams looking to make a move quickly because some other teams might not, or some other teams might be thinking the same thing. In the current landscape of the CDL, a team like Vancouver realistically only has to worry about 9 other teams potentially making a move that would be a player they're interested in as well, just because of Heretics with the all Spanish roster and Vegas Falcons with the all Saudi roster. Obviously, both of those teams could buck that trend and pick up a player like Afro or Neptune, for example, but that just doesn't seem likely. So at the end of the day, that could be something in Vancouver's favor here. It's like there's realistically only 9 other teams that are going to potentially be looking at Afro or Neptune, and then that number shrinks even more when you throw out, a team like Optic, probably Phase, LAT, etc. So it's really a very small, I would say 5 or 6 teams at most, that are looking at some of these NA and EU challenger players. I can't really say EU because obviously Spanish players would count there, but hopefully, my point there is articulated well enough.
Yeah. So and one last thing I'll say about this is the time to make a move as well, because stage 2, or whatever you want to call it, is essentially the most important remaining part of the season, because it has the minor in it, because we don't have minors in the third and fourth major cycle.
Yep.
So there's actually more points on the line in the next 5-6 weeks than there will be in any other 5-6 week period for the remainder of the season. So this is like really the time, if you can just even if you don't have the greatest end to the season, picking up as many points as possible over these next 5-6 weeks is crucial, especially for a team like Vancouver, where they're most likely going to be in that 6 to 11 range, somewhere in there for the rest of the season, I would imagine. So it's very important that they do their very, very best, when they get to the qualifiers, and then the minor as well. Other teams that we want to talk about, though, we should talk about Toronto, because they were at the forefront of our minds, I guess, heading into Major 1, because they went undefeated until the final match of their qualifiers. They went 6-0. They lose that last qualifying match to Optic, and then the Major was not a great event for them, all things considered. I think people were probably expecting a little bit more out of them, considering they were tied for first after the qualifiers. They 3-0 Vancouver, as we mentioned earlier. Then they get 3-0'd by Atlanta, and then they lose 3-2 to Carolina in the losers bracket. So they go 1-2 at the major. They get top 8, or I believe top 6 actually. And it's not a great finish for them. It's not horrible because they could have been Boston and they walked away with a top 12 finish. But what did you see from Toronto? What maybe was different about them from the qualifiers to what we saw at the major? And do you foresee any roster change or any kind of change in them moving forward?
I don't think this team would make a change unless, I mean, just for whatever reason, it's still
Fred?
in my mind, like that you mentioned Pred posting a picture in Toronto or whatever. Like maybe there's something going on there, and just the thought of a Kleenex and Pred sub duo is really interesting to me. But barring like a massive move like that, or one of these other teams making a move for Pred where a superstar caliber player becomes available just because a team decides to replace them with Pred, and then that player becomes available, and then Toronto leaps at that chance. Like outside of something completely unexpected happening, I don't think Toronto will make a change. I just think, you know, we talked about it last episode with Optic and the unprecedented hard point struggles for them. Really, looking at it's only 3 matches here, but in Toronto's match against Carolina, they lost both searches. It was 6-5 and 6-4, so they were still really close. In the Atlanta series, they lose the search 6-3. Obviously, they win the search in the 3-0 victory that they had over um, Vancouver, right? Yeah, they won that one 3-0. That was a 6-5 too. So they played 4 searches, they went 1-3, and it was 6-3, 6-4, 6-5, 6-5. Um, and I think it was a small sample size when I was personally talking about Toronto being the best S&D team in the game. They were 7-0 at one point, then they lost a couple haciendas to Minnesota. They fell to 7-2. I think they ended up at like 8-3 or something in that range after the qualifiers because they lost a search to Optic. And that was like their first non-hacienda search and destroy loss. But um, you know, again, let's just say for without the exact number, let's just say they were 8-3 in search heading into the major, 1-3 at the major in search as an equivalent just doesn't add up. If even if other people in the community wanted to debate who was the best search team heading into the tournament, uh, Toronto was still in that conversation as one of the better search teams early on in the season, and 1-3 from them just isn't going to get it done. Again, close matches individually, couple round 11s that could have gone either way, and that's what happens when you're playing playing good search. Maybe teams are starting to look at what you're doing and adapting their strategies around how well you've been doing and figuring stuff out, counter stratting, etc. But end of the day, when you're playing really well in search in the qualifiers and then you don't play well in search at the major, a less than expected performance results wise or standings wise, placings wise, that was the word thinking, placings, is going to be the end result. So I don't think Toronto makes any drastic change, but I will have my eyes on them in search, especially going forward to see how they respond. And again, maybe it just wasn't their weekend in the search, and maybe we're having a different conversation. A couple of those round 11s go the other way from them. But at the end of the day, that's the thing that stands out to me the most. I do, looking at the notes, there was in that 3-0 loss to Atlanta. Yeah, it was the game one was a vault hardpoint that was 237 to 236, and I put the clip in the notes. It was literally, it came down to time on P2 on vault, and it was literally like a millisecond difference of a BZ trying to jump out of the hill to cancel the time, and someone on Toronto trying to jump in to get that other tick. And that's literally almost as close as it can get in a hard point, especially one you don't see it come down to time very often. And in this game or any games really in recent history, the last game it happened in a lot was like World War II. It feels like it happened a decent amount in Black Ops 4. I think that was 5v5, but um, you just don't see hard points come down to time very much anymore. I'm looking at it now. I can't even see the name of the player from Toronto who like tried to jump in. Obviously, like the contest would make the time tick down in hard point, and that's how the game ends there. So that, I mean, if that millisecond difference goes another way, Toronto wins a map there, maybe that gives them some momentum in the search, or in the search following after that, which they do. They went up 2-0 in the game 2 search against Atlanta, but then Atlanta just won 5 rounds in a row, and they weren't able to pull off a comeback there. So very, yeah, I guess you could say that there is, sitting here talking about search struggles, that, I mean, just statistically 1-3, you play 4 searches, you lose 3 of them, even if they were close. If you were in the conversation for one of the best search teams heading into the event and that doesn't show up, then it shouldn't be surprising to most people that this is what we got out of Toronto, and that's the end result. They weren't at they weren't at the championship Sunday of their quote unquote home major.
Yeah, shout out Fallen in the YouTube chat for showing up. I don't know what to really think of Toronto, because going in, I wasn't super high on them. I don't really consider them, despite how well they did in the qualifiers, to be up to like the standard of LAT, Optic, and Atlanta. Like, I just think those 3 teams are, by themselves, and then, whoever's, in that 4, 5, 6 spot. Toronto's definitely in that, but I don't think, despite the record, I just really don't think that they're up to them, and I don't know if they can get there with this roster. So I guess it really depends on what they're looking for. If they're, I get, the some of the signs that they've said or given us, I guess, they've basically said like they're not going to, spend as much money as they previously were. They obviously had a championship level team for multiple years, but especially these last few years with Scrap, like an MVP candidate. They just have all that talent. They don't have that anymore. And they have talent, like we talked about this past off season, that it would have made sense to kind of move these guys if they thought that, let's make some money, right? Like, that would be the idea, because they have guys that could win championships on other rosters. I don't think this roster has that capability. Certainly they can perform better than this. I think they can get, a 4th, 5th kind of placing at majors, and even higher depending on some of the other results in the tournament. But I just don't see this team as a championship level team. If they were to make a roster change, though, I think I can be convinced that that is different. Pred would be an interesting one, but I don't think he's ever been known as like some kind of S&D savant. So maybe that would take away a little bit of some of the advantage that they've had. At least in the qualifiers, they showed that they had. They are winning 80-85% of their S&Ds, if I'm not mistaken. And then, if they add Pred to that, does that actually hurt them as a team? Because the one part of their game that they were super strong at, maybe they're taking a step back by replacing one of their players with Pred. But he would certainly add some star power to this team and make me a little more confident in them moving forward as a championship team. I think another interesting one, I have no idea if it's plausible or not, it just kind of depends on himself, is Illy. Illy is obviously a great S&D player, historically has been one of the better S&D players. He is from Toronto as well. I don't know if that has any impact whatsoever, but that would be an interesting, it would kind of be like what Seattle did last season, where they're like, we're just going like kind of all in on S&D and hoping that we're able to like pull out these matches just by how good we are in search. Maybe that's the route they go. I tend to agree with you, though. I don't think they make a change. I think this is the exact same roster heading into the Major 2 qualifiers. I just don't know if that's the right move, or I guess it just really depends on what they're looking for. If they're content with being like a middle of the pack or a little bit above, obviously they're not too far down in the standings right now, but maybe they are content not fielding like the superstar teams and kind of doing what LAT claimed they were doing for one season, where they're like, we're going to take a little bit of a step back and try to not rebuild because they have great players, but more just like, we're not going to get in this bidding war with the top three. And so maybe that's their goal in this. Your thoughts on that kind of maybe Pred, maybe Illy, or just maybe just sitting back and hoping that the chemistry can override some of maybe the talent deficiencies when you're talking about the top three.
I just don't think Italy joining, like, I don't know who Italy would replace, because like from a role perspective, it doesn't really make sense for him to replace Beans or Joe Deceives. And I think Beans and Joe Deceives are both, at least at this point, better respawn players. And at least at times, it feels like Joe Deceives has really improved in slaying potential this year. So I don't think, I mean, for a former world champion and S&D perspective, like Illy makes a lot of teams better in that regard. But um, and I do think it's interesting, the whole Toronto connection there with him, like seeing him on his hometown team would be kind of cool. I just don't think it makes a ton of sense, and that's what I don't think there's really, outside of something drastic happening, I just don't see a move that makes a ton of sense to me on paper. I think Joe Deceives and Beans have both shown signs of improvement, and had individual moments where they've really popped off. And obviously, everybody who's listened to the show ever knows what I think about Kleenex and Insight. Like it's just weird comparing it to LAT last year, because it's not like Kleenex is an all-star player, has been and voted an all-star. I'm pretty sure not last year, but maybe the year. No, he was last year, I think.
I
No, it
believe
was
Insight was.
not last year.
Oh yeah, because
Last year
All
was Hydra and
Stars.
Sim for the first team. There was a year. I know Kleenex has been an all-star in the
Yeah,
CDL era since they did the voting. Um, and they both won championships. I don't think either of them got a tournament MVP during like that Cold War stretch, because I think that was like the whole Cammy MVP um era, and maybe even Bance got like the individual MVP for the event they won like during the middle of that year. But regardless, it's not the same situation as like LAT last year, where they're going full budget and picking up players who are very young in their careers, have no championships in the CDL. That's like Kleenex and Insights are veterans at this point. They are both all-star caliber players and have been all-stars. They have won championships. They know what it takes. And the players that they added in Beans and Joe Deceives, they can fall into that category as potentially unproven young players who you're giving a chance and hoping that they hit a little bit of a stride in getting more reps and joining a system with players that um, have that experience. So I think if Toronto, again, they did that whole thing in the offseason where it was like, all our players are restricted free agents, they can go shopping or whatever. And they've done that the past couple years. And guys like Insight and Kleenex have come back each time. So I think there's some degree of loyalty to those two, to the extent that I feel like they are uh untouchable unless they actually want to leave. Like if Kleenex got dropped from this team for anyone, I would be like, what the hell is going on here? Um, I think Insight to a little bit of a less degree, but still, like, just from a loyalty perspective from the organization, I feel like it would be very uh, strange for them to make a move to replace him. And then you're just left with Beans and Joe Deceives, really. And then it's like, well, who are we bringing in to replace them? If we do that, then it kind of just like invalidates everything we've done so far early in the season. So I don't even think I just think this team's sticking together unless something, again, it's roster mania. if one domino falls, it can create a whole avalanche of dominoes after that. So I don't want to say never, but I would be surprised if this team made a move ahead of Major Two. Maybe if something similar happens where they do well in the qualifiers in Major Two and then they flop at the Major itself, then maybe the conversation changes, but we'll have to wait and see.
I think on that last point where you talked about how they've pretty much said like you can go shopping and we'll see what we get with these RFA offers. I think that would be an interesting idea with Pred if they're able to sign them to a deal where it's like, okay, we sign you for this season and then we have like a team option or whatever for next season, and then they just shop him basically in the off season. Like his stock, I would imagine, is pretty low at this point. Not necessarily because of him, but because the top teams that really benefit from Pred are kind of filled. Like they don't really have a spot for him. Where in the offseason, that all kind of changes. Like all these teams mostly are open to change in the offseason where they just, it's kind of like in the NBA. Like the in-season trades typically, I guess, like, just ignoring like the last week, usually in-season trades are a lot tougher to do because of cap and just like the way the roster is during the season. But in the off season, they're a lot more flexible and you can actually make those trades a little easier. And I think the same could be said with the CDL for different reasons. But I think it would be an interesting idea. Obviously, like I've said, and like you said, it seems unlikely that that happens or just anything really happens in regards to Toronto. It would seem more likely that one of like the bottom six teams would probably be more suited for Pred or any kind of changes, because I think there is some kind of hope for most of these teams in the top six. They have seen something that they believe they can build off of, and Toronto certainly, I would imagine, saw quite a bit from those first six qualifying matches, and maybe even their first round win at the major. So we'll see what happens. But I tend to think that they're just going to stand back and let some of these other teams be active in roster mania. Next up, Carolina, a team that is kind of in the same boat or in a similar boat as Toronto because they showed a lot of potential in the qualifying matches. And I would say since the break have been a little bit up and down. The major was pretty impressive for them, all things considered, though. They lose that first round matchup to LAT. Then they beat Vegas as expected. But then they upset Optic. Then they upset Toronto. And then they lose to the Miami Heretics in the losers semis. So they get a pretty good placing. They get fourth. And if you had asked anybody basically at the beginning of the season, where do you think the Carolina Royal Ravens are going to place at the first major, I don't think that there would be a ton of answers saying top four, but they were able to do that. And now, as a result, and because how well they did in the qualifying matches, at least compared to the expectations, they're sitting in a pretty nice spot in terms of the overall standings this season, which, again, not very expected, I would say. They're in third place in the CDL, only 10 points behind LAT, who made it to the grand finals, and we believe to be one of, if not the best team in terms of talent. And Carolina, I would not say is in that category. They don't have the most talented roster on paper, but the results have certainly kind of spoke to the opposite. And now they're 10-5. They have 115 CDL points. Like I said, just 10 points behind LAT. They're 25 points ahead of the Ultra. They're 30 points ahead of Optic. So they are in a great position. I would not imagine there will be any with Carolina. What do you think about this team? We spoke very highly of them during our long holiday break, and then we did not speak as highly about them for the next 3-4 weeks. How do you feel about Carolina right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. Because I feel like it's kind of similar to Carolina in the past, at least from a narrative perspective of this whole like, at some points they're good at one mode and then at other points they're good at another mode or they struggle in that previous mode. The thing heading into this event for them was their hard point. It felt like the talking point from the analyst desk and community, etc., was that they looked really good in hardpoint early on in the season. When the holiday break came back and the hardpoint wasn't up to up to par with what they were showing earlier on in the season, and then heading into this tournament, I know I just mentioned they won two searches against Toronto, so that's obviously indicative of them losing at least one hard point to get to that point. Um, so yeah, in the first matchup Carolina has against LA Thieves, again, LA Thieves obviously make it to the grand finals. They get almost 50-point clubbed twice. It was 250 to 47 map one against the Thieves, 250 to 66 in the uh, second hard point. So 200-point clubs, almost 250-point clubs. Hard point, again, you think highly of LAT as a team from a hard point perspective, but so they win the search there. Lose the three respawns to LA Thieves. Then they play Vegas. Not much to talk about there from Vegas perspective. They win that 3-0. The match against Optic, though, is the one they give up. Optic was 0-4 in hardpoint heading into this series against Carolina, and Optic wins 250, 248. That's their only hardpoint win, though. Carolina wins the next three maps and picks up a hardpoint win against a struggling Optic in hardpoint. So it's you can look at it from two perspectives there. They gave up a win in hardpoint to a team that was struggling at that time in hardpoint, but at the same time, it's a team like Optic that you don't expect to be struggling in hardpoint. Um, and then after that, yeah, we have the Carolina won map one against Toronto in hardpoint 250, 162 on Vol, and they win two searches there. So they went 1-1 in the hardpoints for that one, and they lose both hard points and a search to Miami. So they actually they play a lot of matches because they lose round one and then they win three matches in loser brackets. They played five matches at the major, so it's a lot of math for me to think about. So I would off the top of my head there, feels like the hard point record wasn't great at the event, and then even if it wasn't like terrible, it feels like most of the modes here, the record would have been close to 500, if not a little bit under. So for me, the big thing with Carolina, well, first and foremost, I should have started with this, is I hope everything is good with Vivid and his eye. Whatever the hell was going on with that, it seemed like it was a sty at first. Then they said it might be staph infection, and they're taking him to emergency whatever services there. So hope everything's good with him. It definitely looked better by Sunday than it did on Thursday when the tournament started, but hopefully that doesn't have like some unforeseen consequence on the team, and like he needs to miss time and they have to make a move. Wouldn't be the first time, because obviously we saw Carolina last year with the Real situation and visas. It's different than a health thing, but I was thinking about it after seeing Vivid's eye on Thursday. Like, it literally looked like it was closed. And I went to the CDL roster, CDL website, to look at their roster, and they don't have a sub listed. So in my head, I was thinking, is Brian Saint about to show up to this Carolina losers round one match against Vegas Falcons? And this is how Vegas is going to get their first win, because they're playing Brian Saint, who hasn't competed in, I feel like, almost 10 years now at this point. That's a safe guess. It might even be longer than that. But yeah, all jokes aside, no kidding aside, hope everything's good with Vivid and he's able to be at 100% come Major 2 qualifiers. That is worth keeping an eye on. Maybe it wouldn't be, especially with the way they've played so far this season, it wouldn't. It's weird from a business perspective. It doesn't make the most sense. But if there was some challengers player out there who was willing to sign as a sub for like a close to the previous minimum or whatever you want to call it, not that there isn't an official league minimum salary, that wouldn't be the worst move in my eyes for this team. Like like you said, they're close to the top of the standings. They're looking good for the most part. They're competitive in a lot of series. Maybe we just sign a sub in case of emergency situations and go from there. So not sure if they'll have that same mindset, but long-winded way of me to getting to hyping up TJ, because I think that was really TJ turned back the clock a little bit this past weekend, and he really performed very well. I don't have the stats in front of me, but from the eye test, and even I was watching a lot of the Scump watch party. They were gassing him up. Even Hex was like joking, like TJ didn't play like this when he was on Optic, um, which I don't think is necessarily completely true. I mean, that team they won the first event of Black Ops 4, and after that they LAT and or 100 Thieves and United just were better towards the end of the season. But nonetheless, yeah, I feel like TJ really turned back the clock a little bit and played some of the best Call of Duty we've seen him play in a while. And I definitely thought that's worth shouting out, especially again heading into this tournament on LAN. I was hoping to see, LAN bring out the best in Slasher, his first event in almost a year after the whole Boston situation. Um, without looking at the specific numbers, I would just say I feel like TJ was probably the outlier statistically for this team, and he played very well uh, in my eyes. So I wanted to give him a shout out. And obviously, if that's what it's going to take for Carolina to get a top 4 placing, then maybe that isn't realistic to expect like superstar TJ at every single event, but maybe that, at the same time, maybe like other guys step up if TJ isn't at that level in future lands, and this team can be consistently a top 4 contender, which will be interesting to see. So I think that's where my head's at with Carolina. I think, still some questions around their hard point. At the same time, though, they're winning search in some series and losing search in other series. So it's still going to be a case of finding that consistency and seeing what the recipe for success is for them from a a gameplay perspective, and I guess like mode wise. It's again with Slasher and TJ and even Vivid. I mean, Vivid was a good search and destroy player before he really made a name for himself in the pro scene. You expect a team like this to be good in search. So if the hard point isn't great, then you expect them to be able to kind of make up for that a little bit with being good in search. But if the hard point is slacking and the search starts to slack a little bit, that's when this team could run into some issues. So will be interesting to see how they build off this performance. But I definitely was encouraged by some of the things I saw, especially again from TJ. And looking forward to seeing more from this Royal Raven squad, which like you said, I don't know how many people could have said that heading into the season, really. I know there were a lot of doubters of this squad overall. There were a lot of question marks, to be fair, of the majority of this team outside of Gwen. But so far, they're proving some people wrong.
That was exactly what I was going to say, is that before the season, we even talked about it. It was a question mark filled team. We thought, okay, Gwen is solid. We know generally what to expect out of him. Maybe we don't know exactly what kind of leap he might make, or maybe even a step back as like a second year player. You always hear about like the sophomore slump.
Yeah.
So we weren't exactly sure, but we knew what we saw last year was a great sign for the future of Carolina. But bringing in Slasher and then having TJ and Vivid, all 3 players are like, are they going to be in the CDL like in a year or two? And I think everybody had legitimate concerns about whether they could kind of keep up with Gwyn to a certain extent and be like a team that actually is more than just like, all right, just trying to fight for a champ spot. And the reason that they're in the position they are right now is because these other guys have kind of stepped up and they're no longer as like solid of question marks as we had them pegged previously. Especially TJ, like you mentioned, he performed very, very well at the major, and Slasher I think has just generally been pretty good so far this season. But I looked up the map counts for each of the modes as you were talking, because you were saying like it seemed like the hard point had kind of taken a step back. And so before the major, so I think this includes the minor as well. They were 10-9 in hard point, so a little bit over 50% in hard point, 9-6 in S&D, and 6-4 in control, which kind of reflects how they did. They took a step
Sure.
back, I would say, after the holiday break, and they were a little more inconsistent in general. So, that they're above 500 in all of those modes, but it's not an overwhelming force, I guess, in any of the 3 game modes. At Major 1, though, they were 3-6 in hardpoint. So that's
Okay.
like 33% map win percentage in hardpoint.
And one of those wins is a Vegas win too.
Yeah. And then they were 5-1 in search. So, nearly 85% in search. And that kind of made up the difference because they were only 3-2 in control. So
Wow.
there really wasn't much of a difference in control. So it really came down to the fact that they got as far as they did was pretty much a testament to their search and destroy. That was the only thing that really stood out. So, but we have to kind of consider whether maybe that was an outlier. Maybe they're not as good at search as they showed at Major 1, or maybe they're not as inconsistent and, for lack of a better term, as they showed in the qualifiers and online. Maybe 5-1 is more indicative of what we should expect from Carolina. Maybe not as like overwhelming necessarily, but maybe something like that is more of what we should expect from the Royal Ravens moving forward. Unfortunately, the hard point is going to have to improve, or it's going to be really tough. Like, even though we say S&D wins championships, you have to win respawns on a consistent basis to even get to the second search and destroy and to win those championships a lot of times. So we're going to see if Carolina is able to kind of maybe just improve the hard point a little bit. And then if they're able to kind of keep those numbers, S&D in control, and bring up the hard point, then they're a championship level team regardless of what we might think.
You say that, but FaZe just won the grand finals without winning a single hard point in the grand finals. That is, obviously they won some hard points before the finals, but that was potentially the ultimate Neslo in the grand finals, at least from a best of 7 perspective. But yeah, I do think 5-1 is interesting. That means the only S&D they lost was to Miami on Sunday. So that definitely that's even better than I thought. I mean, it makes sense because I feel like, you think about TJ playing well, even, he was definitely playing well in the respawns, but historically TJ is known as a really good S&D player. So, if I'm just thinking back without thinking of specific maps, like if Carolina's playing well in search and I feel like TJ's playing well, then the two kind of go hand in hand, I feel like. So, yeah, I think that could be. And again, I said this last year, and I got so frustrated with the Carolina team when they had TJ, Clayster, and Fellow, who are all, known for search and destroy at least at certain points of their career. They had moments where they would win searches in series, and then they would show up another week of qualifiers and they wouldn't win a single search. And we would sit here on the pod going over their qualifiers matches, and I'd be like, "What the hell?" Like, it just didn't add up to me. And I don't want to say I'm worried that's going to happen with this team, but that lingering thought of whatever associating that with Carolina as a franchise is just in the back of my head, and I don't want to see that for this team because I think that this team, they've had a good showing early on. If they're able to, again, like you said, maybe not consistently go almost flawless in searches, but if they're able to be a very consistently strong search and destroy team and just pick it up a little bit in one of the respawns, obviously, most likely hard points since there's 2 in a series, but yeah, I think that could be a good recipe for success for them for the rest of the year.
And I think, at least statistically, it seems that maybe the biggest difference was Vivid. Vivid performed really poorly in S&D online. He had a .69 S&D KD before this major. And then at the major, he had a .8, which obviously isn't great or anything. But it's like, that's a huge difference. And Slasher's KD even dropped down from a 1.04 to a .8 as well, and it didn't seem to matter. And like you might say, well, that's because TJ and Gwyn played really well, and that's true, but their numbers are pretty much identical to what they were doing online already. So they didn't really take a step up, so to speak. It was just Vivid took a step up, and even with Slasher taking a step back statistically, it was enough to win almost all of their S&Ds, and all of them until their final match on Sunday. So we'll see what happens. I think it's pretty interesting overall how they were able to do that.
You're saying Vivid had a better KD at the tournament where he could only see out of one eye?
Yeah, I don't know if that's related or not. Maybe he sees too much online, so maybe he needs to put an eye patch on right before he plays.
I do think for any Game of Thrones fans out there, I thought Miles was and even the Twitter played into a little bit, calling him the One-Eyed Raven. Game of Thrones had the Three-Eyed Raven, but the One-Eyed Raven I thought was a sick nickname, and like if that sticks for Vivid going forward, there's definitely worse nicknames you could have. Like I think people still call TG like Fat Bob or just
Fat Bob,
something like that. Like there's worse nicknames you could have. So I was a fan of the One-Eyed Raven.
Yeah, so, and I think this is like the most vivid stat because we've always talked about how fast and aggressive he plays. In S&D, he had almost the same amount of damage per round as TJ did. TJ had a nearly 1.2 KD in Search, and Vivid had a 0.8, and they had like the same exact damage per round. Like that really says like Vivid's just getting after it. He's being active, as we like to say, and
that's with the role swap to AR too, so that's interesting.
Yeah, so he was just like he had the most bloods, so that you would kind of expect that from just like I'm going to be aggressive. Like the most apt comparison to him, at least historically, was Abizi, where they're just like they're doing a lot and it can make teams uncomfortable, especially in Search. Like some teams really like to play really passive and like sit back and let things come to them. And if you have a player like Vivid, where it's like I'm just going to get in your face, that could help, and certainly could help when you have like TJ and Gwen dropping like 1.1s in S&D.
And they were talking during the broadcast for the event about, I think it was specifically on a red card search, so I don't remember which match it was. Maybe it was a Toronto match. But they were talking about how Slasher's style of playing for picks and stuff like that is like rubbing off on the play style of Carolina. So like I'd have to go back and watch, but like if you're able to mix things up like that and like have a guy like Vivid who can get you those first bloods, whether he's playing back with an AR or pull out a sub and get aggressive, like that's definitely something that could work in your favor for like being a strong S&D team, because then you don't know what you're going to expect. And obviously there's different maps where like a map like Vault where offense wins like 90% of the time, everybody's getting after it on that map, right? So like maybe that plays into, I don't even know how many Vault S&Ds Carolina would have played, but like that probably plays into some team's strengths where you have a guy like Vivid who now he can pull out an AR, pull out a sub, mix things up, and then you also have that fallback strat of like, okay, we can all just sit back, play the slasher, S&D as they were saying on broadcast, and just play for a pick, see if the other team makes a mistake, and then we go from there. So just overall, lot to like for Carolina this weekend, despite some adversity with the whole Vivid Eye situation, losing early on in the tournament, then making a little mini run, but beating some good teams down there in winners bracket. Still, like you said with the stats, want to see some improvements in hardpoint. But yeah, I like Search, so I got no problem keeping my eye on Search for Toronto and Carolina to see what they do moving forward.
One last thing about that is Carolina online. So Vivid had 3 bomb plants in S&D that entire time, and he had the least amount or the least number of bomb plants for his team. It was mostly Gwen and TJ. They had like 33, and the rest had like 4, like 10 total. Well, at the major, Vivid had the most bomb plants. He had 9. TJ had 7. Gwen had 5. Slasher had 4. So maybe going into this event, they just changed like, all right, like Vivid, you got bomb now. I don't know if that.
I think TJ was the bomb carrier for the most part, and so maybe like TJ, the rounds he died, Vivid was picking it up and planning. Maybe. I don't know, but I'd have to go back and look to see really.
I just thought that was interesting, like to have 3 over like a bunch of matches, and then you have 5 matches and you have 9 plants total. Or it could also just be like Vivid died so many times in the online portion where he was dropping like a 0.6, 0.7, and it's like, oh, I guess I got a plant bomb now or something. I don't know what. I just thought that was an interesting stat. Last team that we'll talk about today is Minnesota. So we'll talk about Vegas, Cloud9, LAG, and Boston more on Sunday. I don't really know what to think of Minnesota. I don't think they should really do anything. They looked pretty good, all things considered. Like, they're not like a top tier team in terms of the roster. I wasn't expecting anything crazy, but they got top six, same placing as Toronto. And, they started in the losers bracket, which makes it even more impressive because they had to beat Vancouver in the first round of the losers bracket. Then they beat C9, and then they lost to Miami, who had a really good run, all things considered. Like they beat Minnesota in a game 5, and then they beat Carolina. They go to the loser semis. But I don't know. Like I'm pretty impressed by Minnesota. I think they should stand pat. Just
Yeah.
let things kind of play out. I think they're a weird comparison, but I think of them kind of like Vegas last season, before they made the change and dropped Purge, I think it was. And I thought that was like the wrong move, and that was kind of like the way it spiraled out of control for the Legion last season. But I think Minnesota is kind of in that. Like, they have something here. I think they just need to kind of rely on improving their chemistry, and that's just going to come with time and reps. Do you agree with me that they should just kind of sit back and let other teams play around with their rosters?
Yes. So I feel like this is a more apt comparison. It feels like a while ago we were talking about it, but you were talking, I guess we were talking during the Toronto segment about comparison to like LAT last year, like the rebuild approach and all that, yada yada. Um, this feels more in tune with like this Minnesota roster. It seems more comparable to the LAT roster last year, where it's like 4 players, not a ton of CDL experience, go out there. We're not paying them a ton, presumably. Could be wrong. Um, go out there, try and build some chemistry, and see what happens. And this team, I think they've been better early this season than even that LAT team was early on last season. Obviously, they made a couple of roster changes, like we talked about with Afro, Joe Deceives, Kremp, all that. But obviously, we know where LAT ended up last year. They got third at champs, I believe, and then second. They were in the finals of UWC and they lost the Esports World Cup finals.
Yeah.
Um, so we know where they got to by the end of the season. And if you tell Minnesota right now, like, yeah, I think they'd all sign up for that. If you say like, you know, early returns, you keep sticking with this roster, they could be competing in finals at the end of the year. And I don't think, I don't see this team competing in finals consistently, barring something just crazy happening, just because I think, Optic's going to be better. LAT and FaZe already competed in arguably one of the greatest finals of all time, and I would definitely sign up for more of those finals rematches. But I do think the point stands that this Minnesota team has shown this year, they've shown signs that they're a young squad. They've been to a lot of round fives or game fives and had some situations where they didn't clutch up. At the same time, they've been to a lot of game fives. They've played a lot of maps this year. They've pulled off numerous reverse sweeps. They've won multiple round 11s. Like, there's been a lot to like with this Minnesota team, and I really do think highly of this team, especially uh, in comparison to what I thought of them earlier in the season. Like my early expectations and what I said on like wish list episodes and stuff during the holiday break was I just wanted to see more consistency and consistently strong slaying performances out of Nero and Geo. Estriel has really stepped up for me, and he's really played very well in my eyes too. CDL tweeted a tweet just a couple hours ago, 6 hours ago, the top 5 KDs from the major. Geo's at number 1 with a 1.23. Uh, Guys after him like Scrap and Envoy, they played a lot of series, but then Linz is 4 with a 1.13. He only played in one series, obviously, because General Mates lost to Optic. And then Sib had a 1.12. They only played 2 series because they lost to Minnesota. And so the fact that Geo has the highest KD of the event, and it's not a case where it's just a one series showing of the high KD. Like, he played 3 series. It's not, as many as Scrap. If you had to, do that, you would probably consider Scrap had the highest KD of the tournament because he played the most series and had the highest KD by playing in the most series. But the fact that Geo put up those numbers playing in multiple series, I think does speak volumes. Like, it definitely is a good sign of what Geo is capable of, and that's what I wanted to see from him. Especially there was that whole narrative heading on in the offseason about him getting useless kills or whatever. I think it was JCap talking about that. But regardless, I just think overall with this Minnesota team, yes, I definitely want to see them stick together. Um, I think it's so it's hard to like quantify just the impact that this early, even not I'm going to say early success because for lack of a better term, but just like I guess the adversity plus success, if there's a word for that. Like they've been to multiple round 11s. They've pulled off multiple reverse sweeps. They've lost some round 11, sure. They've lost some map fives, but just like that experience for a young roster that they're gaming seems invaluable to me. And it's gonna, I don't want to say it's gonna become second nature, but it's like as the season progresses, if a team is thrown into a reverse sweep opportunity or thrown into a game 5 round 11 and they don't have that previous experience earlier on in the season, it could bode well for a team like Minnesota that does have that experience. So that's what I'm excited about. I just think again, it's going to be tough for this squad to take that leap to be, a championship Sunday squad, but they're knocking on the door. They're definitely a middle of the pack team in my eyes. Maybe not like fourth or fifth, but maybe like a sixth, seventh, eighth, somewhere in there. They would definitely, if I had to do a power ranking today without thinking too hard on it, they would be a team that I would expect to be at champs, probably as one of the final teams to get in. And I would like their odds to pull off an upset unless it was literally like they're the 8th seed and they're playing like Atlanta or LA Thieves in the first round because of the way seeding works. Um, so yeah, I think there's a lot to be excited about with this team. I think there's still room for them to even grow and improve, which is got to be a scary thought for the rest of the league, just because like they're already pulling off upsets and there's still just a young squad with more room to grow. So especially they play a team like Cloud9. Like Cloud9, we'll talk more about Cloud9 Boston next episode. So I guess this is a little teaser, but Cloud9 pulls off the upset against Boston, and you're probably most of the community is probably like, okay, this is the Cloud9 we've been expecting. They're on land. The team's looking better than they did when the whole online server ping stuff was going on. Then they run into a team like Minnesota, and on paper, you're probably like, okay, the veterans, the star power on C9 should prevail here. Minnesota shuts that down. Minnesota moves on. Cloud9's eliminated. So like that's the type of again, just what we've seen out of Cloud9. They aren't on par with like your Atlantas and your LATs and that sort of thing, but middle of the pack, Minnesota, can they hang with those teams? And so far early on, I think the answer is yes. They might not win every time, but they've had a lot of competitive series this year, and they've won a lot more matches and have been in and competitive in a lot more matches than I think many people thought. Because I think a lot of people heading into the year just expected this to be a bottom of the barrel team, not much to write home about. And I have been excited from what I've seen early on.
I think the biggest thing before the season was they don't have like the standout player that a lot of teams typically have. And one of the questions was who's going to be that breakout player, or if there isn't anybody, like when are they going to pull the plug and say like we have to go out and get someone and we're going to replace somebody on this roster with a player that can make that kind of impact. And it seems like Gio might be that guy. Like, he showed a lot of promise last season, of course, but the team results didn't kind of come into play. Like they just were kind of disappointing at the end with Vegas. But if he's able to be the kind of player that he showed right now, and they continue to grow because it's still a young, inexperienced team relative to some of the other teams in the league. If they're able to just kind of grow together, I think they have a shot to be in that top 6. And once you're in the top 6, like you could just get a top 3 or top 4 finish at majors, and it's that makes it a lot easier, and that definitely solidifies your place at champs, and then that gives you a chance to kind of prove what team you really are. But yeah, I've liked what I've saw from Minnesota. They just seem like they're in a different place than someone like Vancouver, where it's like I just don't know
Yeah.
how much higher they can
Yeah.
go. It seems like Minnesota's ceiling is higher than a team like Vancouver, even though I think they entered into the season thinking like, okay, like there are still some really like big unknowns here with both teams. It just Minnesota has just kind of proven and taken away some of that doubt so far this season.
I just went back through the notes, and I know I brought it up at least in some capacity last episode, but I almost forgot to do it here. And I think this kind of even is a better example than what I was saying when I was just going on my little mini rant there. But in the map that Minnesota gets eliminated from the tournament in, it goes to a game 5 against Miami. They go down 5-0, and Minnesota comes one round away from pulling off the full sail in game 5, round 11. And the round 11 was weird. Like it was like Paul X was like chasing, I think, Lucky around a corner, and he shot a little bit too soon. And then Lucky got around another corner. He didn't get a clean shot. And then by the time he got a shot on him, the other Miami player was able to trade him. Um, but nonetheless, like that should speak volumes in itself of like you don't expect a young team like this to be able to have that composure to even come close to orchestrating a full sail 05 comeback with their tournament life on the line. And I think that's just like that should speak volumes to what this team is capable of, even though they weren't able to put the final nail in the coffin and and push forward to close out the full sale, which that I would have been so hyped if that happened. That would have just been, Search and Destroy Kid and me would have loved that, and I'd have been talking about that for even longer on this episode. But the fact they just came so close to even doing it shows like they had that composure, mental fortitude to, you know, come over these obstacles in series that you just wouldn't like if a team like Atlanta was put in that position and they pulled off a full sale. You're just like, yeah, another day at the office for those guys. It's the legendary trio and Draza. They've all won multiple championships, multiple MVPs, multiple S&D titles, yada yada. But for a team like this Minnesota squad, Nero, Gio, Paul X, and Estriel to like be fighting in these series, even if it's against Miami, any situation where it's a pro team, potential for a full sale, like that's such a hard thing to accomplish, and for them to come so close, that just illustrates the potential for this team in my eyes.
Yeah, they definitely have a lot of potential. I think the only thing is like what happens when they start to plateau. Is it time to make a roster change, or do you try to just grind it out with that team? Obviously, I think we're a little bit of ways from actually finding out the answer to that, but
Yeah.
that's what's going to be like the next question. And like I said, I don't think a roster change is in the fold for Minnesota this time around, but maybe after Major 2, halfway point of the season, there might be some discussion if they don't continue to rise up. Maybe that plateau is coming sooner than they expect or we expect. But we'll keep an eye out. Last thing was obviously not a team or anything, but Bounty and Dealership were added to ranked play for testing in all 3 game modes. I think that's interesting. That's probably the way that the CDL should, or Call of Duty should do things, is just put in ranked play, let the greater public kind of test it out and see what they think about it. The only problem is ranked play it by itself is broken, so like that's that I think that's probably what most people are thinking. What are your thoughts on these 2 maps just being added to let people see if they are viable competitively?
Yeah, I think that you bring up a good, like you put these things in rank play, the new maps, and you let the community try it out, and then like if the community hates them in rank play, there's a very strong chance the pros aren't going to even want to bother them. So at that point, you're just like, okay, we remove them from rank play. Pros don't even worry about testing, yada yada. But if you throw a map like these 2 into rank play, the community starts to really like them. It's showing up that there's good feedback, all that. Then you can use that as a stepping stone to be like, okay, pros, we think we might have something here. Can you test it out for us? And then there's still the possibility the pros are like, nah, what the community smoking crack? Like, what are they thinking? Like, they're dumb. This map sucks ass. We're not going to even bother with it. But there's also the potential where the pros are just like, yeah, we might have something here. We'll give it a shot. And then you see what happens. So the only thing I haven't played either of these maps. I know when we were talking about them when the season 2 blog first dropped, they looked a little bit bigger from the mini map perspective, but for some reason the only tweet I really saw about it on the timeline was Parasite yesterday tweeted dealership hardpoint may as well be shipment LOL. And that I don't know exactly what he means by that, but that wouldn't, I think shipment, I think super small map, chaotic spawns. So that doesn't bode well for dealership hardpoint, at least. Who knows? Maybe it's a better control or search map. Um, Not entirely sure there because, like I said, I haven't played it myself yet. But that's the only tweet I saw about these maps. So we'll have to wait and see. But we have this little period now for the break. Definitely a good time for these maps to be tested in ranked play, all that stuff. And then who knows? Maybe we'll see what the pros thinks, and we might have another map change on our hands. I don't know. I do think it's worth mentioning the Hacienda control without having the numbers right in front of me for how much each map was played. I feel like Hacienda control was played a ton. I think Hacienda was played a ton in general this tournament, but I think Hacienda control was played a ton. And I know I mentioned it last episode. Methods was saying it on the Scump watch party. He just like casually brought it up as a point because in the winners finals and grand finals between FaZe and LAT, one time they played, I think it was in the winners finals, all 5 rounds were won by offense, and then in the grand finals, first 4 rounds were won by defense, and the 5th round was won by offense. And he like kind of was like, I think that shows that this is like potentially the most balanced control map, because if you can win consistently on offense and defense, then you got a shot on either. And there have been control maps in the past where you can't really say that. There have been a lot of control maps where it's like, yeah, you have defense, you auto win. So I thought that's an interesting point. I think it's I definitely feel like we saw a ton of Hacienda control, and that might be like the go-to control pick going forward. And I'd sign up for that. There were a lot of sick moments, especially that round 5 offense that FaZe won against LA Thieves in the grand finals. That was a crazy ending. So I'm down to, I think the Hacienda experiment, I think a lot of people were expecting Hacienda to be a good addition to the map set, especially in comparison to some of the other maps that we had as options beforehand. I have seen some talk on Twitter. I think it's been Parasite, actually. I think Easy Mac tweeted something about Rewind too. I don't see Parasite's tweet in his. Maybe it was a reply. I thought he tweeted it at active or at Treyarch or something. I can't find it right now. But oh no, here it is, February 4th. Bring Rewind back at COD League at Treyarch. I think Easy Mac did too. Maybe he just retweeted oh no, he did. February 3rd, we need to start a combo, bring Rewind back ASAP. So that's interesting. I mean, I had said from the beginning, at least from a pub perspective, I thought Rewind was a better map than some people, because some people seemingly were like, yeah, just insta veto this map in pubs, let alone we had the whole conversation in the CDL where it was seemingly the most vetoed map, and that's why Hacienda replaced it. Nonetheless, I think grand picture here, no matter what maps we're talking about in specifics, I do think it's a really cool idea. If we more consistently get the new maps from seasons added into rank play to test, and then we use that as like a experimental ground, potentially before handing it off to the pros to see what the pros think. But I mean, there's also a world where the pros don't ever get asked that, and the league's just like, oh, it's doing well in rank play, let's just throw it in, and that would be a very different conversation. But end of the day, yeah, I do think for the most part, the major had a lot of great moments on the current maps that we have. But I wouldn't be surprised for more map changes. Don't know if these new maps in particular are the answer. But at least there's some conversation around it, and we might have more to talk about on that front. If we do, we'll break it all down for you when it comes.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I think it just depends on you know, I don't tend to think that there will be a ton of viable maps just in general, like because the developers don't typically do that. But you know, we'll see what happens with these 2 maps in particular. Yeah, that about does it, I think, for the show, unless you got anything.
I just saw Jimmy Butler got traded to the Warriors and signed a 2-year, $120 million deal, and my jaw dropped a little bit.
Yeah, I mean that's a bad deal. Just like like, I mean their whole thing was like we're getting old, and they just like doubled down on their oldness. But congrats to them, I guess. Congrats to Jimmy. He finally got that extension that he really wanted. That was literally the only thing he cared about. Like that was why he was telling people not to trade for him. Um, but yeah, I think that about does it for the show. We will be back on Sunday, February 9th, Super Bowl Sunday, or I don't know if we're allowed to say those two words. Big game Sunday, to talk about the last four teams from the major, and just kind of wrap up our major coverage, and then we'll get into the next Wednesday. We'll get into the major two qualifying matches. I think we'll do some power rankings then, so that we can actually just kind of recap what we think, or recap what we think about the teams as we're going in to a completely different stage of the season. Make sure to subscribe, like, or follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music. Our YouTube channel, like Bink said at the top of the show, is at about 204 subscribers. And I think Bink put the goal at 300 subscribers by the end of the CDL season, which gives us 4 to 5 months, I think, which would obviously be crazy, but I didn't expect us to get to 200 certainly by Major 1, but it happened, and we appreciate all of your support as a result of that. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers. Podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. And you can follow Bink on Twitch, twitch.tv/JBN. Oh, let me restart. Twitch.tv/JBINKK. He is nearing a month straight every day on Twitch streaming League of Legends. So if you're interested, you can follow him on there. And like I said, we'll be back on Sunday, February 9th. That's the live show. So if you want to watch, you can watch on YouTube or twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. If not, the podcast will be up Monday morning for you all. See you then. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, if you're a usual listener or watcher of the live shows, I don't expect the show to be at its usual late night/evening on Sunday, because that's when the Super Bowl will be going on. Preston and I will talk after this to see when we're exactly going to plan on going live for that, but we'll be live at some point. And you'll obviously, if you want to know when it is, follow on Twitter, because that's when you'll get the update. But yeah, thank you guys for the support. Like Preston said, shout out Fallen in the YouTube chat. Only chatter who showed up today, but we appreciate all you guys nonetheless. And yeah, we've talked about 8 of the 12 teams from Major 1, breaking down their performance even in more depth than we usually do, because we usually just have one show post major, and then we would take a little break or whatever before we would do the next set of qualifiers and whatnot. So we're going even a little bit more in depth than we usually do, and I've had fun with it. At least hope you guys have enjoyed it too. I think next episode could honestly have some spice to it too. One topic we haven't really talked about, just because we haven't talked about that team, is this whole conversation around Vegas and potentially some teams allegedly refusing to scrim Vegas. So I'm excited to talk into that, and that's a little bit of a teaser for next episode. So if you guys are looking forward to hearing our thoughts on that, that's when we'll be breaking all that down and going through that. But yeah, we also got teams like Boston and Cloud9 we haven't talked about, and we'll be going into our thoughts on their performance and all that next episode. So yeah, that's all I got for this one. Thank you guys as always for the support, and remember to send the chow.